Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in Tennessee. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. The year was 1897, and the rolling hills just east of Knoxville were heavy with late summer heat. Evenings there felt thick, almost breathing. Locals spoke of a faint ringing that sometimes drifted from the low valleys, though most dismissed it as wind, pushing through rusted iron fences of the small burial plots that dotted the land. The hills near Cedar Grove Cemetery, mentioned often in old county ledgers, were among those places people avoided after sundown. It wasn't fear of ghosts then, not at first. It was something quieter, like an unease that hung over the soil itself. In August of that year, a drayman named Charles Petrie brought his cart to deliver pine boards to the church sexton, Elias Moore. The boards were meant for a coffin, but Moore later claimed the request had come not from any family in mourning, but from a gentleman with foreign speech who insisted on anonymity. The man left a sealed envelope with payment and vanished. Moore remembered only that his boots left no sound on gravel, though the night had been still. Within a week, word reached nearby hamlets that a burial had taken place under torchlight, witnessed only by Moore and two laborers who refused afterward to work near the site. One described hearing a faint tapping beneath the boards while they shoveled, though by dawn he'd convinced himself it was nerves. The church record for August 11th listed a burial, female, name withheld by request, which was unusual even then. A second note, half faded, reads, "No certificate, ordered private, reopen only by direction of the constable." That phrase would reappear later in the inquest papers filed by Deputy Aaron C. Hale, who began his investigation when livestock were found dead along the Ridge Road 2 weeks later, their necks twisted unnaturally, their eyes filmed with a grey residue described as dust-like. Hale's first report was skeptical. He chalked it up to disease or lightning strikes, but he noted the ground near the unmarked grave seemed unsettled, as if dug more than once. He ordered the sexton questioned, and Moore's replies, preserved in county transcript, carry a strange cadence. "Sir, I buried her once, but I can't swear she stayed put." When historian Dr. Miriam Covington later studied this file while researching Cedar Grove Cemetery's records for her article on Tennessee's burial customs, she remarked that the handwriting changes midway through Moore's statement. The first half is neat, confident. The rest slants wildly, the ink thicker as if pressed by a trembling hand. By early September 1897, several locals reported hearing low bells at night near the hillside, though no church kept vigil then. Families began keeping lamps lit in windows. The town constable, already exhausted from harvest disputes, dismissed it as hysteria. Yet he too began signing his reports with unsteady strokes, and on one margin, he scrawled a short line never entered into the ledger officially. Something under that ground remembers. When the nights began to cool in early October, the hills turned quiet in a way that seemed deliberate, as though even the insects were keeping a kind of vigil. Elias Moore was found sitting on the church steps at dawn, hat in hand, whispering prayers that did not appear in any hymnal. He told Deputy Hale he had dreamt of the woman whose burial he oversaw, that she stood beside the open grave, asking why he had sealed her in when her eyes were still open. Hale noted this as nightmare delusion, but the tone of his margin notes suggested uncertainty. He authorized the grave's reopening strictly to confirm identity and to satisfy growing unrest among the parishioners. The record of that order survives only in fragments, but the date, October 6, 1897, is scrawled in pencil beside the phrase Cedar Grove. Plot 3B, 3 men were present that morning: Hale, Moore, and a farmhand named Joseph Elkins, who later testified under oath that the soil was soft but cold as if freshly watered from underneath. The coffin lid, according to his written statement, was nailed in an erratic pattern unlike Moore's usual work, with each nail driven at a slant. When the lid was pried up, what they saw caused Moore to flee immediately. Elkins described it simply as wrong breathing, a shallow motion of the chest, faint but visible before the figure fell still. Hale's report makes no mention of breathing, only that the body showed no mark of decay inconsistent with the time elapsed. In the following days, rumors overtook the official account. Some said the woman had been seen walking toward the creek in torn garments. Others insisted it was an impostor, some cruel trick by grave robbers who used chloroform to mimic life. Yet, curiously, none of those rumors appeared in local papers. The Knox County Register of October 12 devoted only a short paragraph to a disturbance at a private cemetery service, and even that issue was withdrawn a week later for printing errors. Deputy Hale continued the inquiry privately, meeting with Reverend Josiah Trent, who kept notes in his parish journal. Trent wrote that Hale visited him weary and white, asking whether Scripture allowed for mistaken death. The Reverend referred him to writings on premature burial, citing recent reports from Europe of safety coffins equipped with bells and tubes. Hale allegedly requested one to be installed at the site, though no invoice exists. The sexton's ledger does, however, mention a bell wire and iron cap ordered for Plot 3B, delivered 18 Oct. Dr. Miriam Covington, in her later study of Cedar Grove's customs, pointed out that this date coincides with a shipment of European-style burial safety mechanisms imported through Charleston that autumn. A curious alignment of fact and legend. The next entry in Hale's handwriting reads only, "Bell rang once at 2:17 in the morning, ceased before moonset." After that, his reports stop. His name disappears from county payrolls by November. Local memory preserved him differently, as the man who opened the grave too many times and listened when silence was required. Some said they saw him weeks later walking toward the mountains, hat pulled low, muttering about voices beneath the frost-hard earth. By mid-November, frost covered the ridges, and a hush had settled across the valley so complete that even the dogs ceased to bark after nightfall. The absence of Deputy Hale did not go unnoticed, though few seemed eager to discuss him. The constable's chair remained empty at the county meeting, his badge turned in by a silent courier who offered no name. The envelope also contained a single sheet torn from a field notebook. On it, in Hale's firm but fading script, were just 5 words, "Do not hear the bells." In the following weeks, Cedar Grove Cemetery became a place of unspoken dread. The sexton's house stood empty, and townsfolk reported the church doors swinging open despite being bolted from inside. Mrs. Clara Donnell, who lived nearest the cemetery, told the Register's substitute editor that she sometimes saw a dim figure near the slope, lantern in hand, pausing at each grave as though counting. The editor never printed her story, yet a copy of her statement appears folded within the parish records, suggesting that someone in authority wanted it preserved privately. The last known sighting of the woman, if indeed it was the same, came from a railroad porter named Luke Crandall, whose affidavit was later filed under miscellaneous testimony. He claimed that just before dawn on November 28th, he saw a woman in black walking along the tracks 2 miles east of the station, bareheaded despite the cold. When he offered assistance, she looked at him and he noted no light in the eyes, yet no blindness either. He thought she might be sleepwalking and reported it to the marshal. The description matched the unknown buried in Plot 3B, but no one came forward to confirm it. Dr. Miriam Covington's later commentary on these events, found in her research appendices concerning Cedar Grove's burial customs, remarks that premature burial fears were common in Tennessee at the century's end. She referenced European cases from 1896, where bell mechanisms were used to prevent mistaken interments. Her interest was academic, yet she concluded that folk panic often emerges where procedure meets guilt. Many locals took that line as a polite way of saying someone in the county had buried a living soul and could not endure the knowledge. When winter reached its deepest point, a small fire consumed the church records room. The cause was never proven. Only the ledger of graves survived, blackened at the edges, containing one additional note believed added later by unknown hand, moved again by request of no one. After that, the site fell out of regular use. The parish merged with another town, and Cedar Grove's southern lots overgrew with briar and lichen. Yet travelers passing by on the old wagon trail still spoke of faint metallic tones at night, a sound neither quite like wind nor metal striking stone. Those who attempted to trace the source reported their compasses spinning wildly near the hillside. Even the new sexton refused to stay after dusk. He was quoted in a letter to his cousin as saying, "There is still movement beneath the settled dirt, as if the ground breathes when no one watches." Snow came early that December, covering the narrow road that wound toward the old cemetery, muting sound and hiding all trace of recent passage. Only a few men still spoke of the events of autumn, and they did so in hushed tones behind tavern doors. The name of Deputy Hale became a cautionary echo, someone to invoke when urging restraint or silence. Among the few papers to survive from that winter is a physician's report, unsigned, found decades later inside the binding of a county ledger. It describes a female body retrieved from shallow interment, exhibiting rigidity inconsistent with decay and ocular clarity preserved. The document bears no date, yet its measurements correspond to the height and build recorded for the anonymous woman of Plot 3B. If authentic, it suggests the coffin was disturbed again after Hale's disappearance, though no official record mentions an exhumation. An annotation in the margin reads, "Buried again per family insistence, family name withheld." No family ever claimed her publicly. The absence of kin fueled gossip. Some said she had come from the Carolinas, others from further west. A letter addressed to Mrs. W. Petrie, care of Cedar Grove Sexton, postmarked February 1898, remains in the county archive unopened, sealed under wax hardened to a brittle shell. Whatever it contained was deemed too delicate or too meaningless to read. That spring, a new clergyman, Reverend Samuel Crowe, was assigned to the parish. His diary, later cited in a university paper on Appalachian folklore, mentions that the graveyard carries a breathing stillness by day and by night the impression of attendance. He ordered the installation of an iron gate and had the bell rig dismantled, claiming that its mere presence invited hysteria. The workman who removed it insisted the wire leading into the soil had been cut from beneath, not above. One of them, Thomas Kittrell, told his foreman he heard the bell ring once more as he carried the pieces to the wagon. His account was dismissed, but he never returned to that job. The remaining months of 1898 passed quietly. The county clerk replaced missing pages in the registry with clean paper, noting simply "records restored." By the turn of the century, newcomers to Knoxville knew nothing of the affair beyond a half-told story used to frighten children away from trespassing near the hills. Dr. Miriam Covington, revisiting Cedar Grove decades later, while compiling her treatise on Tennessee burial traditions, found only the scorched foundation of the church and a handful of leaning stones. Yet she noted that one grave, unmarked but roughly the size of the disputed plot, appeared freshly tended even after years of neglect, the soil loose as if recently turned. Locals offered no explanation. A farmer who pastured goats nearby told her, "Every thaw the ground there sinks a little, for then lifts again by morning." Covington wrote in her field notes that such cycles might be natural frost heave, yet she underlined the word lifts twice, then added, "Sound of thin metal reported at dawn." In 1901, a traveling journalist named Edwin Mallory arrived in Knoxville, researching an article on burial reforms. His notebook, preserved in partial form at the County Historical Society, contains a passage concerning a forgotten cemetery at the base of the eastern ridge where earth refuses stillness. He claimed that a retired gravedigger directed him to Cedar Grove, now little more than stone outlines and frost-bitten grass. Mallory found traces of a burned chapel, and beside it a hollow where the bell rig had once stood. In a later entry, he recorded meeting a shepherd who pointed out faint depressions in the soil, explaining that they shift after rain like lungs drawing airpiece. Mallory's curiosity deepened when he read Dr. Miriam Covington's study of local burial customs referencing the same ground and its controversial use of safety coffins. She cited no names, yet Mallory recognized the region. He wrote that the townsfolk reacted with studied ignorance whenever he mentioned the 1897 burial. One innkeeper told him flatly, "We don't answer questions about people who won't stay down." Mallory returned the next evening carrying a lantern and a small phonograph recorder, hoping to capture the rumored midnight ringing. The recording cylinder survives, warped but labeled Cedar Grove, Jan 14, 1901. A transcript typed decades later notes faint metallic tones recurring at irregular intervals, followed by a human voice whispering what sounds like, "Let it be quiet." Whether that phrase was spoken by Mallory or captured ambiently remains debated. He left town the following day and was never traced further. His luggage arrived weeks later by rail, forwarded from Bristol without explanation. Inside was his camera, undeveloped plates and a letter addressed to M. Covington, University of Tennessee, stating only, "The air here moves from below." No further official investigation followed. The sheriff at the time closed the file, writing, "Matters of the past should rest beneath it, yet the towns along the ridge retained their superstitions. Children were warned not to play near the lower fence after sunset. Shepherds claimed their dogs would not cross that soil." A carpenter named Eli Worsham attempted to repurpose boards from the old chapel in 1903 and fell ill shortly after, insisting he dreamt nightly of someone knocking from under his floor. The boards were returned to the site. The illness passed, but his mind did not recover. He spent the rest of his days drawing rectangles on the walls of the poorhouse, muttering that they forgot the second box, Dr. Covington, reading Mallory's lost letter years later. Commented in her notes that Appalachian burial practices blended practical fear with spiritual dread, creating stories that outlived evidence. She closed her essay with an observation about Cedar Grove's location, how its position at the mountain's foot placed it between the settled valley and the wilderness beyond, a threshold where the living are never entirely certain the dead have departed. That phrase re-entered local speech. Older residents used it when fog settled low across the ridge. Even today, hikers speak of a faint chiming drifting from unseen slopes. No one agrees on its direction, and compasses near the old site spin as if confused. Some say it's iron under the ground reacting to storms. Others recall Deputy Hale's warning scribbled before he vanished. "Do not hear the bells." By 1905, the cemetery was scarcely visible from the wagon road, half swallowed by undergrowth and mountain laurel. A surveyor sent from the county seat to mark new property lines mentioned that his mule refused to cross a certain patch of earth, as if it sensed something beneath. The report, tucked between real estate deeds, bears the note, "Ground unfit for measurement, unstable below." Around that time, a young schoolteacher named Ruth Denning began collecting folk accounts for a regional magazine. Her surviving manuscript, Tales from the Ridge Country, contains a section labeled "The Woman Who Slept Twice." It describes a veiled figure seen walking near the creek, eyes open yet distant, and men who carried shovels but could not remember why. Denning claimed to have based her story on older townspeople's recollections of events from a hill cemetery abandoned after a mistaken burial. Though she softened the language for publication, her draft reveals she had read fragments of Deputy Hale's notes and considered them genuine. She also cited Dr. Miriam Covington's study of Cedar Grove Cemetery as evidence that premature interments were not rare in Tennessee at the century's end. Denning's editor rejected her story for being too precise to pass as folklore. The following winter, travelers through the pass spoke of lantern lights moving among the trees, though no houses remained. A constable from Knox County inspected the area after reports of trespassers. His memorandum states he found the soil near one depression cut through and packed again, perhaps by animals, perhaps by men. Inside, he noted old wood turned soft as ash, faint smell of iron. The phrase repeats across 3 pages, growing less legible, until the handwriting breaks into uneven lines. The report was never filed officially, but later surfaced in a family trunk sold at auction in 1931. Even then, the county seal was missing, as though deliberately removed. In 1907, the parish that had absorbed Cedar Grove's records held a memorial service for unclaimed graves. Among the hymns performed was one titled "Rest Still, O Wanderer," composed by Reverend Crowe shortly before his death. The sheet music bears a small dedication to ACH. Scholars assume the initials refer to Aaron C. Hale, the vanished deputy. The melody is slow and circular, each verse returning to the same unresolved chord, like an echo that never finds rest. Local choirs refused to sing it, saying the tune unsettled livestock and made oil lamps flicker. When Dr. Covington revisited the county in 1910, she found that even mentioning the hymn caused unease among older residents. In her later lectures, she spoke of Cedar Grove as an example of collective guilt condensed into geography. Her remark captures the town's silence more accurately than any police record. To outsiders, the ridge was just another patch of land, but to those whose grandparents remembered the burial, it remained a place avoided at twilight, when light thinned and every sound from the mountain seemed deliberate. Children were taught to turn away if they heard a bell ring twice, and more than one traveler claimed that near the foot of the slope, their lantern glass trembled, though the wind was still. By the spring of 1911, the valley had begun to change. Railway lines extended closer to the ridge, new settlers arrived, and yet none dared clear the ground around the old cemetery. The property was technically public land, but its boundaries remained uncertain, because every attempt to stake markers ended with the poles collapsing into soft soil. A contractor from Georgia brought machinery to level part of the slope for a storage yard. On the third day, his foreman wrote that one of the laborers uncovered a hollow gap in the clay that gave off a cold breath as if the mountain itself exhaled. They filled it quickly, citing safety concerns. The job was abandoned within the week, and the equipment left rusting under rain. In the county archive, an unsigned memo dated June 3, 1911, records a meeting between the clerk's office and Dr. Miriam Covington, who happened to be visiting to lecture on Tennessee's burial reforms. She warned them, according to the minutes, that the slope's composition was unstable and possibly riddled with forgotten vaults. Her words were pragmatic, but she included a note from her earlier studies. Cedar Grove was known for experimental coffins fitted with signaling devices. She did not elaborate, but her tone apparently chilled the room. The clerk added that several attendees requested the discussion be removed from the official transcript to avoid local superstition, that some are a group of railway engineers camping near the ridge reported hearing what they thought was the striking of metal during a thunderstorm, a rhythmic sound like chain against stone. One man, Alfred Jett, swore he saw a woman's figure in black crossing between lightning flashes. His colleagues dismissed it as exhaustion. Still, when morning came, they discovered fresh soil washed down across the track embankment, exposing fragments of pine wood and an iron hook consistent with coffin hardware. The company foreman ordered the section reburied immediately and moved the camp a mile south. By autumn, newspaper correspondents revisited the case after Denning's old folklore article resurfaced in a literary annual. One small piece in the Knoxville Journal mentioned persistent tales of bells in the mountain, referencing Dr. Covington's earlier research without naming her directly. It framed the matter as local color, yet the editor admitted privately to colleagues that readers had mailed letters describing similar sounds. Among those letters was one from a retired constable living in Morristown who claimed to have served under Deputy Hale. He insisted Hale was not dead but had gone to follow what stirred beneath the grave. The handwriting was shaky, the story incoherent, but it ended with a final line underlined twice. He said the earth itself holds breath. When the journal attempted to verify the identity of the letter's author, the return address led only to an abandoned post office near the Ridge Road. Inside, according to later accounts, lay a single rusted bell cap, like those once fixed to safety coffins, a relic no one wanted to touch. That winter, after a season of heavy rain, a portion of the hillside collapsed. County workers sent to inspect it found nothing but roots and stones, yet several refused to return, claiming the soil gave underfoot as if hollow below. The site was fenced again, the report sealed away in the courthouse basement. And so the ridge slept once more, though not everyone believed it slept alone. By 1913, progress crept closer to the ridge in the form of telegraph poles and a new stage road. The townspeople welcomed these changes, but drew an invisible line at the fenced slope of Cedar Grove. The contractor responsible for grading the road, a Scotsman named Henry Baird, recorded in his ledger that he heard soft hammering from beneath, while his crew dug a drainage trench. He blamed the echo of pickaxes, yet one worker swore the blows came long after everyone had stopped. They filled the trench with gravel and moved the route a few yards west, marking the old cut with a crude cross of branches. That cross survived several storms, each time rebuilt by unseen hands. Around this time, Reverend Crow's successor, Pastor Matthew Lynn, attempted to restore the church foundation for a new congregation. He wrote in his letters that he hoped to bring light to the ridge. His tone changed after only 2 visits. In his final entry dated June 1913, he confessed, "The ground breathes cold. It is like standing upon a vault whose tenant disapproves of intrusion." His assistant later burned the correspondence, but one page survived, recovered from the chimney sweep's brush. It bore a faint sketch of the ridge, marked with a circle where the woman's grave had once been. Dr. Miriam Covington, then teaching in Nashville, returned briefly that autumn for research. In a private field note, she mentioned meeting an aging sexton who remembered Deputy Hale. He told her Hale had once planned to build a proper tomb above the disputed grave to keep it still, but the project never began. She copied his words exactly. He said stillness is earned, not given. She found the phrase haunting enough to use in a later lecture on the psychology of forgotten burials. Students recalled that when she recited it, she looked as if listening to something beyond the hall. Meanwhile, the mountain itself seemed to shift with every storm. Heavy rains opened fissures that oozed grey clay. In one such washout, a farmer's son discovered a curved fragment of glass identified later as part of a viewing window from a coffin lid. The discovery never reached newspapers, but the artifact disappeared from the courthouse drawer where it was stored. Folklore collected during those years began to mix Hale's name with the veiled woman's. Some versions claimed they were kin, others that he had tried to save her. In every retelling, both were buried by the same mistake, one by soil, the other by silence. Denning's reissued anthology cited these accounts as examples of collective atonement myths, but she admitted privately in her correspondence that they were drawn too close to the line between record and rumor. By 1915, when the telegraph poles finally reached beyond the ridge, their wires hummed faintly even on windless days. Linemen attributed it to tension in the metal, but locals insisted it was the echo of that old bell, traveling through wire instead of air. The sound carried far, some said clear to the courthouse, before fading at dawn like a sigh retreating back underground. In the summer of 1916, heat lay thick over the valley, and thunderclouds gathered daily above the mountains. The storms rolled down in narrow sheets of rain that filled gullies and broke through the ridge fences. Each time the flood receded, something in the soil shifted. Small depressions near where the old church once stood, sometimes a shallow sink, sometimes a mound. County workers filling one of these holes reported finding a section of iron wire stretched tight through the clay, running deeper than their shovels could reach. They cut it and buried the rest. That night, a neighbor half a mile away swore he heard a bell ring 3 times. His affidavit remains in the courthouse file, though the clerk at the time penciled a note beside it. No bells remain on site. Ruth Denning, now middle-aged and teaching in Nashville, revisited the ridge in early autumn. Her diary recounts a sense of dread she could not explain. The air trembles though no wind stirs. The place knows itself. She sketched the outline of the cemetery fence and marked one corner with a dot labeled "Voice Here." Local guides refused to accompany her after dark. When she returned to town, she delivered a lecture on Tennessee folklore, quoting Dr. Miriam Covington's observation that the border between custom and haunting is merely the persistence of memory. Denning told her audience that memory itself can ring like a bell if left too long unanswered. 2 weeks later, she suffered a collapse during class. Her last words to a colleague were reportedly, "She's still awake under there." Covington's correspondence from that same year shows unease. She had received Denning's field sketches and remarked on the accuracy of their topography, details only a trained surveyor could have drawn. In one letter to a fellow historian, she confessed, "I no longer trust the quiet of that soil." Soon afterward, she abandoned her research on Cedar Grove altogether. Her later lectures referenced it only once, calling it a study best left to the earth. By 1918, the ridge became a restricted area after a minor landslide uncovered several wooden beams and rusted fittings. The county declared the site unsafe and posted signs warning of collapse. During that inspection, a laborer named Garrison found a small brass plate stamped with initials ACH, likely Deputy Hale's, but when he turned it over, the back carried a faint inscription, "Rest still." The plate vanished before it could be catalogued. Garrison left town within the month, claiming illness. That winter, soldiers home from Europe passed through the valley and heard the story. One of them, writing to a friend, described camping near the ridge. He noted that at night their horses shied from the slope, and that the ground seemed to answer the weight of our steps with a hollow pulse. The phrase appeared later in a local Physician's notebook underlined twice. He added no explanation, only the line, "Perhaps some graves learn to breathe forever." By the spring of 1919, Cedar Grove was almost entirely swallowed by grass and creeping vine, its fence posts half buried, and the path to the ridge little more than a scar of gravel. Yet the stories refused to fade. A letter preserved in the county archive, dated March 3rd and signed by Reverend Elam Price, describes visiting the slope to bless the ground after hearing that soldiers camping nearby had spoken of tremors in the soil. Price wrote that as he read the final verse of his prayer, "The dust shivered as if stirred from beneath, and my candle was snuffed though the air was still." He left the place unblessed. The county magistrate later questioned him, but Price insisted it was no specter, only unrest. In those same months, a young geologist from Chattanooga, Samuel Forrester, conducted surveys along the mountain base for potential mining leases. His field notes mention a subsurface void accompanied by intermittent vibrations, possibly water channels. The entry concludes with an unusual addendum, accompanied by a single chime, frequency untraceable, metallic but dull. Forrester's assistant resigned immediately after that survey, claiming nightmares of voices calling from underground. The report was filed but never published. Dr. Miriam Covington, though retired from active teaching, responded to an inquiry about Forrester's findings. In her reply, she referenced her earlier work on Tennessee's burial customs, remarking that metal acoustic devices, like the safety coffin bells once used at Cedar Grove, could carry sound through soil long after decay had consumed the mechanism. She theorized that heat and moisture might produce resonance, creating the illusion of a signal. Her explanation satisfied the academic. Yet privately she wrote in her journal, "If it is only sound, why does it choose the hours before dawn?" That summer, the valley endured a drought so deep that wells dried, and cattle wandered near the ridge seeking water. One farmer, Abel Nokes, wrote to the county clerk complaining that his livestock refused to graze near the old fence, snorting like they smell thunder. He later found one cow collapsed beside the hollow ground, its ears bleeding faintly as if from pressure. The veterinary note cites unknown atmospheric cause. Noakes sold his farm and left before harvest. By 1920, the township reclassified the ridge as protected woodland. Officially, the decision stemmed from erosion control. Unofficially, no one wanted to disturb what lay beneath. At night, the new highway lights cast a glow against the mountainside, revealing the faint line of the old graveyard wall, a jagged edge between cleared land and shadow. Travelers who stopped at the overlook claimed that from that angle, the hills seemed to rise and fall in the moonlight, breathing like a sleeper uneasy in dreams. The county denied such illusions, yet survey photographs show slight undulations in successive exposures, as if the ridge changed shape between frames. Those who compared the negatives said the motion appeared centered, around a single spot, the unmarked plot believed to be 3B. Even the most skeptical clerk who catalogued the images admitted in pencil on the back of one print. Still there, still moving. Through 1921 and 1922, the ridge remained fenced and quiet, yet a persistent hum crept into the valley during long, humid nights. Farmers described it as iron singing low. Telegraph operators working along the new lines said the wires carried an intermittent pulse that did not match any schedule of messages, a faint vibration that made their earpieces tremble. One operator, a veteran named Roland Vess, noted the interference always peaked near midnight when the wind was still and the mountains veiled in mist. His supervisor dismissed it as static from the wires crossing mineral seams, but Vess resigned within months, claiming, "The signal speaks words if you listen too long." That autumn, a small landslip revealed a section of brickwork embedded in the hillside. County engineer reports describe it as a retaining wall of no known purpose, but beneath its base, they found fragments of wood and corroded hinges. The material was collected, then inexplicably lost en route to Knoxville. The clerk who signed the shipping form later wrote a private note to his brother, "Smelled of wet linen. Could not bear to touch it." At the same time, local children rediscovered the story through their grandparents' recollections. They invented a game called the Waking Bell, in which one child lay still while others whispered the name of the veiled woman. Parents forbade it after a boy failed to wake immediately and, when roused, said he had heard a hammer underfoot. The game vanished from memory, except for a single rhyme recorded by a teacher in 1923. If she hears you speak, her name ceases, bells will ring and ground will shake. Dr. Miriam Covington, nearing the end of her life, read about the landslip in a short geological notice. She wrote a letter to the editor, reminding readers of earlier safety devices buried in the region, citing her 1890s study of Cedar Grove Cemetery. Her tone was cautious, almost pleading. Artifacts, she said, should remain where placed, for they were not built to be disturbed twice. The letter drew little attention, yet the archive clerk who filed it later added a marginal remark. She speaks as though it still listens. By 1925, lightning struck the ridge repeatedly during one violent storm. Witnesses claimed that after each flash, they saw something metallic glinting among the trees, as though the earth briefly revealed a hidden skeleton of wire. When dawn came, the fence posts were scorched but intact, and on the highest stone remained a faint impression of a hand, darkened as if by soot yet outlined sharply. The photograph taken that morning shows nothing beyond weathered rock, though those who handled the print said they smelled iron and damp cloth. That winter, Reverend Price's successor conducted a midnight vigil, hoping to lay the rumors to rest. He reported stillness until the final prayer, when frost crackled over the soil though the air was above freezing. His closing line in the parish book reads simply, "Something below answered by 1926. The county had long abandoned attempts to map the ridge. Official surveyors refused the contract, citing unstable ground and persistent magnetism interfering with compass bearings. The area was quietly omitted from new topographical charts, replaced with an empty contour labeled private woodland. Yet a few curious men still ventured there. One was Dr. Samuel Forrester, the same geologist who had once recorded a chime in the clay. He returned with improved instruments and 2 assistants, intent on proving the vibrations were geological. Their field journal, only partially recovered after his death, contains the note, "Frequency now constant, not wind, source below 12 feet. The next page is stained with rain and ends mid-sentence. Both assistants later swore the wires on their seismograph snapped, as if pulled from beneath. They left the apparatus in the pit and sealed it with stone. Forrester continued alone until dusk. He was found the next morning wandering near the creek, unable to recall his name for several hours. News of this incident spread quietly. Local editors declined to print it, but travelers heard whispers in taverns of a doctor listening to the ground until it spoke. When Dr. Miriam Covington heard of Forrester's collapse, she wrote to a colleague that she feared her old work had unsettled the soil as much as the mind. She advised that Cedar Grove should remain untouched, adding a chilling sentence, "If they dig again, they may not be the ones to fill it." By that autumn, small fires began to appear on the slope, brief blazes that burned without visible fuel. Witnesses described them as bluish flares, silent and circular, rising from the earth and vanishing after moments. The county sent a deputy to investigate. His report states he found no scorch marks, only frost rings where the grass had whitened in perfect circles. He left before sundown and resigned the following week, declaring the ridge unfit for men or scripture. In 1928, a new landowner attempted to fence the property for grazing. He ordered the removal of several old stones, among them one large slab marking the likely site of Plot 3B. The laborers managed to shift it only a few feet before retreating, claiming the stone sang through the crowbar. The owner dismissed their fear and returned that night to complete the task himself. At dawn, his wagon was found overturned, the slab resting exactly where it had been before, the harness torn but the horse unharmed. The man sold his deed within the month. Dr. Covington died that same year, leaving behind a final notebook. Among botanical sketches lies a last entry referencing Cedar Grove and the bell mechanism imported through Charleston in 1897. Her line trails off but ends with, "Still audible when the earth warms, still waiting." By the close of the decade, even memory of the place had thinned. Yet those who lived near the base of the ridge claimed that on certain mornings the fog seemed to rise from one point alone, a small hollow where no grass grew, and where, if you stood very still, the ground beneath your boots beat faintly, slow, deliberate like a tired heart that refused to rest. Amen. In the early 1930s, during the first lean years of the Depression, Scavengers returned to the ridge searching for salvageable timber and scrap. They found the old church foundation buried under vine and moss. A man named Porter Hicks pried loose a rusted hinge from the debris and sold it for pennies in town. The buyer, a blacksmith, later melted it for iron and complained of a strange hiss in the forge, like air escaping bone. Word spread that Hicks had angered the ridge. Within weeks he was dead from pneumonia caught on a windless day. His widow swore she heard a faint bell outside the window the night before his fever broke. The doctor recorded the death as exposure, but the undertaker refused to bury Hicks in Cedar Grove soil. Around that same time, county students from the university began a modest excavation under the Works Progress Administration, cataloguing forgotten sites for preservation. Two young historians, Robert Nash and Helen Tierney, sought Dr. Miriam Covington's remaining papers for reference. Among them, they found a rough map of Cedar Grove marked with circles labeled subsidence points. They matched the markings to existing terrain and were astonished by their accuracy. Each ring corresponded to an area of collapse recorded after storms. In their field report, they noted soft resonance underfoot, metallic taste in air. The project halted when one student fell into a shallow pit that opened suddenly beneath him. He was unharmed, but said he felt something pushing upward, steady as breath. The supervising foreman closed the dig that afternoon. In 1933, a flood from the Holston River washed part of the hillside into the creek, exposing what appeared to be a narrow shaft lined with boards. The county sealed it with concrete, citing danger of further erosion, though one laborer confided to a reporter that the boards were not rotted, just wet and smooth like they'd been handled recently. The brief article in the Knoxville Sentinel mentioned the find without naming the location, but old residents recognized the description. Within days, locals again reported bells. 3 slow peals carried on mist after midnight. Helen Tierney kept a private journal of that season. She described feeling watched while walking the perimeter and hearing faint knocking beneath the mud. "It is rhythmic," she wrote, "too measured for water." She ended her entry with a reflection on Dr. Covington's earlier warnings. She wrote of guilt condensed into geography. "I begin to think she meant that the ground itself learns remembrance." Tierney left academia soon after, taking a teaching post far from the valley. Nash stayed behind but ceased writing publicly. His neighbors later said he walked the ridge each evening until his death, pausing near the fence with his head bowed as if listening. By 1935, Cedar Grove had disappeared from newer county records entirely. The land was described only as non-arable, subject to seepage, but those who still lived along the foothills claimed to hear low sounds at dusk, never louder than breath, never fully gone. A farmer put it plainly to a visiting journalist, "There's something up there that ain't finished being alive." In 1936, drought returned to eastern Tennessee, cracking the riverbeds and leaving the ridge dry and brittle. With vegetation burned away, the faint outlines of old graves resurfaced, long depressions running parallel like scars across the slope. A group of boys exploring the hill discovered a small brass bell half buried in dust. Its clapper was missing, but when one child struck it against stone, a tone faint as breath lingered in the air. The next day, the bell was gone. The boys swore they left it on a windowsill. Their mother found only a damp circle where it had rested. The house dog refused to enter the room for a week. That summer, an aging historian named Ellis Vandry attempted to write a local chronicle titled The Sleep of the Hills. He interviewed surviving witnesses of the 1897 events. Few remained. Most were vague, their memories frayed by age, but one former parish clerk, nearly blind, told him, "We buried her 3 times and the Lord heard every shovel." Vandry included the quote, though his publisher later struck the line for superstition. He continued researching until his notes became disordered, pages torn, ink blurred by moisture. His final entry reads, "I heard Hale's bell from the hollow, clear as judgment." The manuscript was never completed. Meanwhile, workers constructing a new telephone line along the lower valley encountered interference on the wires. The signal carried an irregular pulse recorded by engineers as intermittent tone unassigned origin. The disturbance ceased whenever they cut power, returning only near Cedar Grove's boundary. One technician compared it to the tremor of old church bells, swaying without striking. The company replaced the segment of wire and relocated the pole line downhill. But a field memo preserved in archive margins admits, pulse persists, faint but constant. In 1938, a forest fire swept near the ridge. The flames circled but did not enter the old burial ground, diverting as if by wind, though meteorologists reported calm air. When investigators later surveyed the perimeter, they found soil damp beneath a thin crust of ash. A surviving report from the Tennessee Forestry Division comments, moisture anomaly suggests subterranean venting or spring, none located. Locals called it mercy, saying the dead had protected their own. By 1939, only a few remembered names remained connected to the site: Deputy Hale, the unnamed woman, and Dr. Miriam Covington. An article in a regional academic journal reflected on Covington's early studies of Cedar Grove, suggesting she had tapped into a broader anxiety about the boundaries between life and repose. The author closed by, noting that the ridge's coordinates had vanished from federal maps and that memory alone sustains its location. That autumn, heavy rains returned. Witnesses claimed the mountain gave off a low resonance audible even in town, like a bell tolling underwater. Those who lived closest said it grew louder with each storm. A teacher traveling by carriage after dark wrote that his horse halted near the slope and would not move. The air shivered, he recorded, and in that stillness I heard the sound of soil sliding back into place, as if something below had drawn breath and settled again. When 1940 arrived, the war in Europe occupied headlines, and the small towns near Knoxville turned their attention away from old superstitions. Yet the ridge remained a quiet wound on the landscape, unvisited except by surveyors mapping new flood control routes. In April of that year, two of them, Howard Lemley and Joseph Keene, camped at the foot of the hill. Their logbook, preserved in the state archives, recounts clear skies and still nights until the third evening, when the air trembled as though from distant thunder. Lemley wrote that their instruments, sensitive to ground motion, recorded a rhythmic pulse lasting precisely 4 minutes. He compared it to breathing through stone. The following morning, their tent ropes were coated in fine grey dust, though no wind had blown. They left before finishing the survey. In town, elders revived talk of the old burial when news spread that one of the surveyors had fallen ill, his hearing failing after what he described as a constant low bell that no one else could hear. Physicians diagnosed inner ear trauma, but the man insisted the sound grew louder each night. He vanished from hospital records 2 weeks later, discharged at family request. No family could be traced. A new pastor assigned to the parish that once served Cedar Grove attempted to consecrate the land from afar, reciting prayers from the valley road. He later wrote in a letter to the bishop that he felt the words sink rather than rise. His candle extinguished mid-sentence, though there was no wind. The letter survives with a smear of wax across the signature, the final line reading, "If redemption is possible, it lies beneath, not above." That summer, lightning struck the ridge again, igniting a single oak that burned from inside the trunk. When it fell, townsfolk discovered its roots entwined around a section of iron wire, fused into the wood as if it had grown through it. The county stored the piece in a basement crate labeled, "Unknown Artifact, Do Not Display." No record shows its disposal. Dr. Miriam Covington's papers were re-examined that year by the university's new folklore department. Among her correspondence, one note to a student stood out: "If ever you walk the ridge, do not linger near the hollow after rain. The ground there holds memory like breath in a chest." Scholars debated whether she meant it poetically, but locals recognized the warning. In late autumn, a traveling photographer attempted to capture the valley's fog for a regional exhibit. His glass plate negatives, rediscovered decades later, show normal scenery, except for one frame where a faint luminous shape appears behind the fence line, indistinct, the size of a standing woman. The exposure note reads, "Fog drifted against light though sun had set." Experts attribute it to lens flare. Still, when compared to early parish sketches, the shape aligns precisely with the location of Plot 3B. As the decade closed and the world braced for war, Cedar Grove faded again into rumor. Yet those who climbed the mountain trails at dawn claimed that if they stood very still, they could feel the ground move once, slow and deep, like something beneath shifting towards sleep, but never quite finding it. The spring of 1941 brought new work crews to the ridge. men hired under federal programs to plant erosion control pines. They came with little knowledge of the land's past and joked about ghosts until the first evening's rest. Their foreman, a veteran named Hollis Brandt, recorded that the soil sweats at dusk, meaning that moisture rose from the ground like breath. He noticed it most at one particular hollow where his men refused to pitch tents. A laborer named Jess Willard swore he felt warmth coming from below when he set his shovel, as if the ground exhaled against his palm. They finished planting early and left without collecting pay. Brandt's report, filed weeks later, contains a marginal note in smaller handwriting. Heard a faint bell from the hollow before sunrise. 3 short tones, then silence. In nearby Knoxville, archivists revisiting the 1897 burial registers prepared a centennial exhibit on Tennessee cemeteries. Among the documents misfiled in their boxes was a brittle envelope addressed to the keeper of the third plot. Inside lay a folded parchment bearing the faint watermark of Cedar Grove's old parish seal. The single line written in fading ink read, "Rest her or she will rest you." The curators assumed it a hoax and destroyed it, but a copy survives in a private collector's notes. That autumn, a minor earthquake shook the valley, barely noticeable elsewhere, yet strong enough to crack the thin fence posts around the ridge. Residents of the nearest farmhouse said their windows rattled as if struck by small stones. When they stepped outside, they heard what sounded like a distant bell ringing once, muffled and long. The tremor registered nowhere else in the county. Geologists attributed it to shallow slippage, though one remarked that its waveform repeated precisely every 11 seconds, like measured breathing. As war loomed, the ridge grew deserted once more. Letters from soldiers stationed abroad mention memories of home, fog, bells, and the mountain that never stopped whispering. One wrote that when he dreamed of Tennessee, he saw Deputy Hale standing beside an open grave, whispering, "Do not hear the bells." He woke each time to the sound of artillery, distant, yet somehow tuned to that same slow rhythm. By 1943, Cedar Grove had vanished entirely beneath pine and undergrowth. The old road no longer reached the fence. Hikers stumbled upon fragments of iron and mistook them for roots. One diary found later by park rangers describes a hollow sound under each step, like walking on lungs. They left the trail unmarked thereafter. And in the final years of the war, when church bells rang to announce victory, a few of the older townspeople swore they heard an echo come back from the hills, not in triumph, but in answer. It was slower, deeper, almost thoughtful, as though the ground itself were listening and remembering. By 1944, the ridge lay hidden beneath a canopy of pine, its outline softened by years of silt and moss. Only the faint rise of the old cemetery wall could be seen from the valley road, when fog settled low. Wartime shortages kept locals busy. No one had cause to climb there except a postal worker whose route passed nearby. In a letter to his sister, he wrote, "I hear the pines whisper metal." She thought it poetic until his mailbag was later found beside the path, unopened letters dusted with grey ash, though there had been no fire. The man himself left the county without notice. The post office marked his file transferred, no record. That same year, the state's Historical Commission received a request to verify the location of Cedar Grove for inclusion in a registry of pioneer churches. The assigned researcher, Clara Bevan, relied on Dr. Miriam Covington's early notes and traced the coordinates to the base of the eastern ridge. Her field diary describes the place with restrained precision: ground uneven, no birdsong, odor faintly metallic. She mentions hearing a distant tone at dusk, a drawn breath through iron. Her official report, however, omits any reference to sound, concluding only that the site's remains were beyond restoration. In late summer, torrential rain swept across the county. Landslides closed roads, and for the first time in years, water carved deep into the old slope. When it subsided, 2 hikers discovered a shallow trench with timbers exposed. They marked the spot and informed authorities, but by the time deputies arrived the next day, the earth had slumped back in place, as though leveled by unseen hands. The men insisted they saw coffin boards, each with a nail driven at an angle. The deputies filed a brief note: "No evidence found, ground stable." Folklore around Knoxville revived once more. Old voices on porches recalled Deputy Hale and the woman buried twice. Some claimed that the ringing of the town's air raid sirens carried an extra echo from the hills. When questioned, engineers confirmed a return wave but blamed the terrain. To the older generation, the sound meant the ridge was answering again. After the war ended, Cedar Grove slipped quietly from conversation. Government maps covered it with a new name, Oak Bend Forest Reserve. Yet those who walked the trails at dawn sometimes reported a sense of pressure underfoot, like slow-moving air. One park ranger wrote that his boots lifted slightly as if the ground sighed. He did not mention it again. Near the year's close, a university clerk cataloguing Covington's unpublished letters found a final loose page dated faintly, Spring, 1928. It read, "The heart under the hill beats in its own season. Perhaps one day it will rest." The clerk included it among botanical notes, unsure of its relevance. It was the last documented mention of Cedar Grove before memory itself began to thin. Winter of 1946 settled heavy and quiet over the valley, muffling every road and chimney in a pale hush. The new generation knew Cedar Grove only as a name whispered by elders reluctant to explain it. The war had changed people, made superstition seem smaller, yet the ridge remained untouched. When snow melted that March, rangers inspecting flood damage noticed a faint depression near the center of the old slope, oval like a footprint. One leaned closer and swore he heard water dripping beneath though the ground was dry. They marked the spot, took a photograph and moved on. The print, kept in the county file, shows nothing but blurred earth and a single shadow shaped like an open palm. In May, a pair of travelers stopped at the overlook to rest their truck's engine. They reported seeing fog rise from the ridge in distinct columns, as if breath from unseen mouths. The story reached town, but no one went to verify it. The road washed out weeks later, cutting the route entirely. Locals said the mountain had chosen solitude again. Old journals from nearby farmhouses still mention the sound of bells carried on storm nights. Some claim they're wind in the trees, others say it's the echo of distant trains. Yet there's a rhythm to them, slow, deliberate, like something remembering its own heartbeat. In an attic chest preserved by the county museum lies the last note from the 1897 investigation, Deputy Hale's single page spared by fire. The ink has faded to brown, but under angled light one can still read the line scrawled across the bottom, "If the bell rings again, leave it be. It is only asking to be heard." No one ever found Hale's grave nor the woman's. The parish was never rebuilt, and the soil at Cedar Grove was never certified stable enough for homes. Every attempt to plant new foundations ends the same way. The earth sinks overnight, then rises smooth as if nothing had touched it. Dr. Miriam Covington's former students sometimes visit the ridge out of curiosity. They take photographs, measure the ground, listen for wind. A few have said they felt vibrations when standing near the unmarked hollow. One described it as a pulse beneath centuries, faint but certain. The photographs they bring back are always ordinary, trees, fog, stones, yet each frame carries a slight blur near the center, like the air itself refusing stillness. And so the story remains, sealed within its own century. Cedar Grove's coordinates have long vanished from maps, but on certain nights, when fog rolls through the Tennessee hills and the sky holds its breath, travelers swear they hear a low bell drifting over the valley. Some say it's memory, others iron. Whatever it is, it rings only once, and when it fades, the mountain seems to breathe,